She ran a 41-floor empire. He packed his daughter's lunch. She thought he was wasting his potential. He thought she'd forgotten what mattered. Then the data proved him right. Then she lost a $400,000 bet. Then she found out why he never stayed late. Why his hands had paint on them at 8 a.m. Why he wrote in pen when everyone else typed. The secret wasn't on his resume. It was walking home from school in a persimmon raincoat. And when Renata Voss finally saw it, she stopped being a CEO. She became human again. The conference room on the 41st floor smelled like dry erase markers and ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a gray Portland morning, the Willamette River a dark ribbon below, and the city's bridges hung in the mist like sentences left unfinished. 12 people sat around an oval table of pale birch, laptops open, coffee cups sweating rings onto the wood, and at the head of it all stood Renata Voss, 44 years old, dressed in a charcoal blazer that had cost more than some of the people in this room earned in a month. She was not cruel by design. That was the thing people who'd never worked for her always misunderstood. Renata Voss had not climbed from a single-bedroom apartment in Spokane to the chief executive's chair of Arrowwood Solutions by being casually mean. She was precise. She was efficient. She had learned early that sentiment was a tax on clarity. And she had spent 20 years refusing to pay it. "The halcyon account," she said, setting her tablet on the table with a soft click, "is not performing. It hasn't performed in 2 quarters. I want to know why, and I want to know by 10 o'clock this morning, which gives us—" She glanced at her watch, a slim, unadorned thing on her left wrist. 47 minutes. Around the table, eyes moved sideways. Someone's keyboard ticked quietly. A woman near the window, mid-30s, pulled her blazer tighter. Callum. The name landed flat in the air. At the far end of the table, a man looked up from a yellow legal pad. He had been writing by hand, which was already unusual enough in this room to draw small, involuntary glances from his neighbors. He was 38, with dark hair going silver at the temples, a face that held its angles quietly, and the kind of stillness that either read as confidence or as someone who had learned not to waste energy. He wore a navy corduroy jacket over a plain white shirt, no tie, and there was a small smudge of what appeared to be poster paint. A thin stripe of cerulean blue, along the outside edge of his left hand that he had apparently not noticed, or had noticed and decided was not worth the effort of addressing before an 8 a.m. meeting. His name was Callum Adare, and he had been a senior data analyst at Arrowwood for 3 years. "The halcyon underperformance is a modeling issue," he said. His voice was even not particularly loud, the kind of voice that made people lean slightly forward. "It's not the account. The projections we built for them in Q2 were drawn from aggregated retail data that didn't account for their specific regional suppression pattern. The model predicted a 12% lift. The actual ceiling was closer to 7. Everything downstream from that number is wrong because the input was wrong." Renata studied him. "That's a very clean explanation for something that cost this company $400,000 in projected revenue." "It is," he agreed. "It also means the fix is structural rather than relational. We don't need to renegotiate with Halcyon. We need to rebuild how we weight regional variance in accounts with their distribution profile. I've drafted a methodology correction. It's about 6 pages. A beat." 6 pages, Renata said. 5.5 if you remove the footnotes. Someone at the table made a sound that was almost a laugh before catching it. Renata's gaze moved across the table and the sound stopped. She looked back at Callum. He was looking at his legal pad again, writing something. "Send it to my assistant by noon," she said, and moved on. The meeting ended at 9:53. People filed out in the usual way, in clusters of 2 and 3, the quiet conversations that began in hallways and died before the elevator arrived. Callum gathered his legal pad and his pen and his phone, which had 3 notifications on it that he'd been ignoring for 40 minutes, and walked toward the door. "Adare." He turned. Renata was still at the head of the table, scrolling through something on her tablet. "Is there a reason," she said without looking up, "that you write by hand in these meetings?" He considered. "It slows me down in a useful way. Writing by hand makes me think about what I'm actually putting on paper instead of just transcribing everything that's said." She glanced up at him then. A brief, measuring look. And the paint. He looked down at his hand. My daughter's science fair project. Planets of the solar system. I was helping her color Saturn last night, and apparently I am a messier painter than I thought. Renata's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted a degree, the way a camera shifts focus without otherwise moving. How old? 8. She nodded once, the way someone nods when a piece of information has been filed. Noon, she said again, and looked back at her tablet. Callum walked out. He had moved to Portland 3 years ago after Miriam. He did not think of it that way exactly. He did not organize his life around the before and after of his wife's death the way grief counselors sometimes suggested people did, drawing a clean line through the calendar. He thought of it more as a long recalibration, a slow process of learning how to run a household, raise a child, hold a job, and still be a recognizable version of himself all at the same time without the person who had known him best. It was not dramatic. It was just steady and sometimes very heavy and mostly invisible to anyone watching. He lived in a 2-bedroom house in the St. John's neighborhood, near the cathedral, with green painted shutters and a backyard small enough that he turned most of it into a raised garden bed, which his daughter Petra treated as a combination laboratory and art installation. She had planted sunflowers and cherry tomatoes and, at some point this past spring, an entire tray of wildflower seeds she'd scattered with the statistical precision of someone who did not believe in statistical precision. The result was chaotic and dense and genuinely beautiful, and she photographed it regularly with a disposable camera she'd asked for as a birthday gift because, she had explained to Callum with complete seriousness, digital photos feel too easy. Petra was 8 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her own very specific way of understanding the world, which was to ask a question about it, listen carefully to the answer, and then ask another question that revealed the first answer had been insufficient. She was the kind of child who made adults feel simultaneously delighted and slightly outmaneuvered. Every weekday morning, Callum made her breakfast, usually eggs, sometimes oatmeal if the night had been short, packed her lunch, walked her the 6 blocks to Irvington Elementary, and then drove to Arrowwood's offices downtown. He picked her up at 3:15 unless a meeting ran long, in which case she went to the after-school program and waited for him with a book and an expression of patient disapproval that she had perfected. He suspected, through careful observation of him. On the days he picked her up on time, they had a ritual. She would tell him one thing she'd learned that day, and he would tell her one thing he'd noticed. Not something that had happened to him, something he had noticed. The distinction mattered to Petra, though she had not explained why, and Callum had not asked, because he sensed it was one of those things she was still working out. He had, over the course of 3 years, noticed a remarkable number of things in order to have something worth offering. The Halcyon methodology document went to Renata's assistant at 11:58. Renata read it the same afternoon. She sent back 2 comments via the internal system, both of which were corrections to his terminology in the executive summary. She preferred calibration error to modeling flaw because the latter implied negligence rather than iteration. He updated the language. She approved the document for distribution by 4 o'clock. He was surprised. He had expected it to sit on her desk for 2 days while she decided whether the problem was as structural as he'd described, or whether she was going to make it someone's performance issue instead. The approval was either a signal that she trusted his analysis or a signal that she was moving too quickly and would circle back later with objections. He filed it under unclear and did not think about it further. He had a science fair project to finish. The evening was October cool and smelled of wood smoke from somewhere up the block. Petra sat at the kitchen table surrounded by styrofoam balls of varying sizes, tubes of paint, bamboo skewers, and a reference printout of the solar system that she'd annotated in red pen. Her annotations were not corrections. She'd confirmed the information. They were questions, small arrows pointing to details that had struck her as interesting enough to pursue. "Did you know Neptune has a storm bigger than the whole Earth?" she said, not looking up. "And it's been going on for like hundreds of years?" "I did know that," Callum said, tying on an apron. "Does it ever just stop?" The great dark spot actually dissipated. They watched it disappear. She looked up. "What happened to it?" "They don't know exactly. It just stopped." Petra considered this for a moment. "That's sad," she said, and turned back to her Neptune. A dark blue sphere the size of a grapefruit, which she proceeded to paint with focused, careful strokes. Callum made dinner while she worked. Rice and black beans and a fried egg on top, because it was a Wednesday and Wednesdays had become, without formal announcement, the night they ate things that required minimal dishes. He set a plate beside her at the table, moved 2 styrofoam planets to make room, and sat down across from her. "What did you learn today?" he asked. She looked at him. A pause that was, he had come to understand, her actually thinking and not just performing the ritual. That when you're scared of something, your body does the same thing whether the thing is real or you're just thinking about it. Like your heart doesn't know the difference. He looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" "Ms. Hendricks. We did a unit on the nervous system." She picked up her fork. "What did you notice?" "There was a smudge of paint on my hand at a meeting this morning," he said. "And the most powerful person in the room noticed it. And instead of being embarrassed, I felt like it was a kind of proof of something." Petra ate a bite of rice. "Proof of what?" "That I went home last night and helped my daughter paint Saturn." She considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Then she said, "Saturn was the best one. We got the rings really good." "We did," he agreed. The science fair was on a Friday in early November, held in the school gymnasium with the particular acoustic warmth of 100 conversations happening inside a big, high-ceilinged room. Petra's solar system was mounted on a trifold display board, each planet hanging from a horizontal dowel by fishing line at a scale that was, she pointed out to every visitor, not quite accurate because accurate scale would have required a gymnasium 4 times this size. She won second place. First went to a child who had grown bean sprouts under different colored lights, which was, Petra acknowledged in the car afterward, a solid experiment with good controls. "Were you disappointed?" Callum asked. "No," she said. She was looking out the window at the street lights coming on. "Second is fine. I liked explaining it to people. You were good at that." "I know," she said simply. It was not arrogance. It was just an accurate observation. He had to stop himself from laughing. "One thing you learned today?" She didn't hesitate. "That explaining something to someone who doesn't know it yet makes you understand it more." He nodded. "I've heard that from researchers. They call it the protégé effect." "What do you notice?" He thought. "That you handled second place better than most adults I know would have handled it." She seemed satisfied with that, and they drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet that had become one of the better things about his life. The Halcyon correction was approved in January. It worked. The revised model put 2 other accounts' projections back in range and identified a third account where the same suppression pattern had been misread. Renata sent a company-wide note crediting the analytics team. She mentioned Callum's methodology by name, which was unusual. He noticed that it was unusual, in the way he had learned to notice things without necessarily knowing yet what they meant. February brought a reorganization. Arrowwood was restructuring its analytics function, pulling it up from a departmental support role into something more central, a strategic intelligence unit that would feed directly into executive decisions. The new unit needed a director. Renata convened a small group to discuss candidates. Callum was not in the room. He was at his desk, building a variance model for a retail client, when his manager came to his door and told him he was wanted upstairs. The conference room was different this time. Smaller, a corner room with windows on 2 walls and a low round table that made the conversation feel less like a briefing and more like something being negotiated. Renata was there, along with Arrowwood's chief strategy officer, a tall Scotsman named Gregor who dressed like a professor and thought like an engineer, and the head of HR, a soft-spoken woman named Yolanda who took meticulous notes in a small notebook. "Sit down, Callum," Renata said. He sat. "We're building something new," Gregor said, and outlined the structure of the intelligence unit with the efficiency of someone who had explained it several times already and had refined it down to its essential bones. Callum listened. He asked 2 questions about reporting structure and about whether the unit would have authority to push back on decisions that contradicted its findings or only authority to advise. The second question made Gregor glance at Renata. Renata's expression was neutral but present. "Why does that question matter to you?" she asked. "Because a unit that advises but can't push back is a unit that tells people what they want to hear," Callum said. "That's not intelligence. That's confirmation." A pause. "The unit will have formal dissent rights," Renata said. Written into the charter. He nodded. Then yes. I'm interested. Yolanda wrote something in her notebook. The process took 6 weeks. There were other candidates. Callum knew of 2, both internal, both technically capable, both more comfortable with the performance of ambition than he was. There were reference checks and a presentation he gave to a group of 7 executives on a Thursday morning. Using no slides, only a whiteboard and a series of questions that he walked the room through until they arrived somewhere none of them had been before the meeting started. Renata watched from the end of the table with her hands folded and her expression giving away nothing. He was offered the directorship on a Tuesday in late March. The offer came with a significant salary increase, a small team of 5 to start, and the formal dissent rights that had been written into the charter as promised. He accepted. He called his mother in Spokane, who cried briefly and then recovered and told him his father would have been proud of him. He made Petra a special dinner, pasta with the sauce she liked. The one from the jar that she maintained was better than anything he made from scratch, which he had quietly come to agree with, and told her about the new role. She ate 2 full plates of pasta and then asked, "Does it mean you'll work more?" "Probably some weeks, yes." "Will you still pick me up on time?" "Most days. And on the days I can't, I'll tell you in the morning so you're not waiting without knowing." She appeared to evaluate this arrangement. "Okay," she said, "but I want to hear about what you notice. Like, from the new job." "You'll hear everything," he said. The intelligence unit launched in April. Callum hired his 5-person team with deliberate care. He did not prioritize credentials. He prioritized the quality of questions people asked in interviews, which he had found to be a more reliable indicator of how they would actually think under pressure. 3 of his 5 hires had unconventional backgrounds. One was a former high school history teacher who had retrained in data science. One had spent 4 years doing field research in rural Indonesia. One had a background in architecture and had come to analytics through urban planning. Renata raised an eyebrow at the architecture background during a staffing review. What does urban planning have to do with strategic analysis? Systems thinking and spatial reasoning are the same cognitive skill deployed in different contexts, Callum said. She thinks about how information flows through a structure the same way she thinks about how people move through a building. I want that perspective. Renata looked at the candidate file for a moment. Then she moved to the next item. The unit produced its first major piece of analysis in June. A 60-page review of Arrowwood's client retention patterns that identified 3 structural weaknesses in the company's renewal process and proposed a corrective framework. The analysis was methodologically dense and written with a directness that Gregor, reading an early draft, described as refreshingly blunt. It identified, among other things, a decision made 2 years ago by Renata herself. A pricing restructure that had been presented internally as a success but whose long-term retention effects had been masked by a favorable market period, as one of the contributing factors to a 20-month attrition trend. Callum sent it to her before distributing it to the broader executive team. Her response came 12 hours later, at 6:47 in the morning. He was making breakfast. The message said, "The pricing analysis in Section 4 is correct. I knew at the time it was a short-term solution. I chose it anyway because we needed the quarterly number. Include it in the final report." He read it twice, set his phone down, cracked 2 eggs into the pan. There was a quality in her he had not quite named yet. It was not warmth. Warmth was not the word. It was something more like willingness. A willingness to be wrong quietly without performance. He thought about that on the walk to school with Petra that morning. The city was warm and smelled of cut grass. Petra was telling him about a book she'd started. Something about a girl who discovers that the town she lives in has been built on top of an older, invisible town, and how the people in the old town don't know the new one is there. "Does it scare you?" he asked. "No," she said. "I think it's about how people live in the same place and don't see each other." He looked at her. She was 8 years old. In September she would be 9. She was wearing a raincoat the color of a persimmon, even though it was not raining, because she had decided she liked the color and saw no reason to reserve it for rain. "One thing you noticed," she said, preempting him. "Not yet. It's still morning. You can save it," she said. "For later." He had come to think of that as one of the truest things anyone had ever offered him. You can save it. For later. He saved it. The thing that happened in July was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It arrived in the way that most consequential things arrived, sideways, in the middle of something else. There was a company event. Arrowwood held a summer gathering each year, nominally a thank you to staff, practically an exercise in controlled socialization. It was held on a rooftop venue near the river, a Tuesday evening, and attendance was technically voluntary in the way that things organized by the chief executive were technically voluntary. Callum brought Petra. He had not planned to. A babysitting arrangement had fallen through at the last moment, and he debated simply not attending. But he had a brief presentation to give on the intelligence unit's first quarter output, and skipping it would have sent a message he didn't want to send. So he brought her, asked her to be patient, promised her they would leave by 8, and gave her a book and a small bag of pretzels and a spot at a corner table with a view of the river. Renata noticed her arrival. She noticed most things. She was standing with Gregor and 2 members of the board when Callum arrived with the small girl in the persimmon raincoat. It was not raining, the sky was a faded summer blue, and she watched them for a moment before returning to her conversation. The presentation took 12 minutes. It was well received, which in an Arrowwood context meant that people asked substantive questions rather than nodding politely. Callum fielded the questions and then excused himself and went to sit with Petra, who had eaten all the pretzels and was deep in her book. He sat down beside her. She did not look up. Is it done? Mostly. Good. She turned a page. Renata found them 20 minutes later. She had a glass of sparkling water and had moved through the event with the efficiency of someone completing a checklist. She stopped at their table. Callum looked up. This must be the Saturn painter, Renata said. Petra looked up from her book. She examined Renata with the direct attention she brought to things she found interesting. Yes, she said. Dad had paint on his hand at your meeting. He did, Renata said. Are you reading for pleasure or because you have to? Petra blinked. Pleasure. Mate, it's summer. Something moved across Renata's face. Fast, almost imperceptible, like a light reflected off water. She looked at Callum. She's very direct. She is, he said. My daughter was like that. Past tense. Quiet. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Petra looked between them with the careful attention of someone taking notes. Then she looked back at her book, which was a kind of generosity, Callum thought, giving 2 adults a moment to be in something without having to explain it. How old? He asked. Renata looked at the river. She would have been 17 this November. He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say, and he had long since stopped trying to say it. Renata set her water glass down on the table. The Q3 analysis. I want the team to look at the acquisition pipeline, not just retention. The two are more connected than we've been treating them. Already started, he said. She looked at him. Of course it is. She picked up her water glass. 8 o'clock is when she falls asleep, is it? Close enough. Then you should go before 8, Renata said, and walked back to the event. He watched her go. Petra did not look up from her book, but after a moment she said, her daughter died. Yes. Does she talk about it? I don't think very often. Petra turned a page. That makes sense, she said, with the matter-of-fact compassion of a child who had grown up knowing what it meant when a parent went quiet. The Q3 analysis was the best piece of work Callum's team produced that year. The acquisition-retention connection turned out to be more significant than anyone had realized. There was a pattern in which clients acquired through certain channels were systematically more likely to churn at the 18-month mark, not because of the product but because of how they had been onboarded, the expectations that had been set, the language that had been used to close them. The pipeline was poisoning the relationship before it began. Gregor called it a paradigm shift. Renata called it a correction. The correction required changes across 3 departments. It was not simple and it was not fast, and it required Renata to have several conversations with department heads who had been running their processes the same way for years and did not immediately welcome the implication that they had been doing it wrong. One of those conversations, with the head of sales, a man named Vincent who was good at his job and knew it, escalated into a disagreement that made it to Renata's calendar as a formal review. Callum was asked to present the analysis in the room. He did. Vincent was a prepared opponent and made 3 substantive challenges. all of which Callum had anticipated and addressed with data rather than argument. The third challenge, that the churn pattern could be explained by client industry rather than onboarding method, required him to pull up a secondary table that showed the pattern held across industries when controlled for channel. Vincent studied the table for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, just that. No performance, no gracious concession speech. 2 words." Renata looked at Vincent, then at Callum. "We restructure onboarding. Timeline? 90 days for the critical path," Callum said. "Full implementation by end of Q1. Done," Renata said. Walking out of that meeting, in the corridor with its pale floors and its gray morning light coming through tall windows, Callum passed Renata going the other direction. She was already on her phone, already moving toward the next thing. She stopped. "You prepared for his second challenge," she said. "Not a question." "And the third," Callum said. She looked at him. Something in the look was different from the measuring quality he was used to. There was something steadier in it, something that had resolved. "He would have found the second one on his own if you hadn't had it ready," she said. "The third one you built for him. I thought it might be the strongest objection to the methodology. So you anticipated it so thoroughly that you took it away from him." "I didn't want him to find it after the fact," Callum said. "That would have been worse for everyone." Renata was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that had weight. "Did you know, when you took this job," she said, "that you were going to be more useful to this company than the 3 analysts I was considering before you?" He considered the question seriously. "I thought I could be. I didn't know." "How long before you knew?" "The Halcyon document," he said. "When you approved it same day." She tilted her head slightly. "That told you something about me. It told me you were capable of moving fast when the information was sound. That meant the analysis could matter if it was done right." She was quiet again. Then, "My daughter's name was Clara." A pause. "She died in a car accident. 3 years ago, October." He did not say "I'm sorry." He had learned, in his own grief, that those words were not wrong, but they were sometimes inadequate to the size of the thing. "She'd have been turning 14 that year," he said, doing the arithmetic quietly. 13, Renata said. "Young." A single word carrying everything. She looked down at her phone, not reading it, just holding it. "I became very good at moving fast," she said. "After. I found that if I stopped for too long the room got too quiet." He understood that precisely. He had done a version of the same thing for a while, filling the house with noise, with projects, with plans, until Petra had looked at him one evening and said, with the clarity of a child who had not yet learned to be diplomatic, "Dad, you don't have to do so many things. I'm here." He didn't tell Renata that. It felt like something that belonged to Petra. "The onboarding restructure is going to require buy-in from the regional leads," he said instead, because work was sometimes the kindest way to give someone a direction to walk toward. "I'd suggest a series of small group briefings rather than a single all-hands. Smaller rooms make the objections easier to address before they calcify." Renata looked at him. "When did you start being so careful about how you deliver things?" "My daughter," he said simply. 8 is a complicated age for a person to understand something difficult. "I learned to think about how to bring information into a room." She studied him for a moment, not the measuring look, not the evaluating one. Just looking. The way someone looks when they are recognizing something they had not previously been able to name. "She's a remarkable child," Renata said. "She's better than I deserve," he said, which was not false modesty. It was the most honest thing he knew how to say about Petra. Renata almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It was the beginning of one caught and held back. But it was real. "I disagree with that assessment," she said, and walked on. October arrived with rain and early dark and the smell of the leaves on the sidewalks, the particular wet sweetness of the Pacific Northwest autumn that Callum had come to love in a way that was quiet and permanent. Petra turned 9 on the 14th. He made her favorite breakfast, French toast with strawberries, and she wore a paper crown she'd made herself, decorated with accurate drawings of the planets in correct orbital order, and she was perfectly happy about this. Her one birthday request had been a trip to the coast, and so on the Saturday following, They drove the 90 minutes west and spent the day on Cannon Beach, where the enormous sea stacks rose from the water like the ruins of something ancient, and the waves came in with the steady patience of something that had been coming in for a very long time and planned to continue. Petra found a sand dollar and held it up to the gray light. It was perfect, unbroken, pale as old chalk, the 5 petals of its surface intact. "One thing you learned today," Callum said. She turned the sand dollar in her fingers. "That sand dollars are actually animals. They're related to sea urchins. They eat by catching tiny particles of food in the spines." She looked at him. "What did you notice?" He looked at the ocean, at the sea stacks, at his daughter, 9 years old, persimmon raincoat against the gray air, holding a small perfect thing in her hands. "I noticed that every time I think this is as good as it gets," he said, "it turns out there's more." She thought about this. Then she put the sand dollar carefully in her coat pocket. "You can keep noticing that," she said. "I think it's going to stay true." They drove home in the dark with the radio on low, Petra asleep in the back seat before they'd reached the coast range. Her head tilted against the window and the sand dollar in her pocket and the paper crown, slightly damp now, in her lap. There was a board meeting in November. Arrowwood had a quarterly presentation to its investors, and for the first time, the intelligence unit's findings were part of the formal agenda. Callum prepared a 20-minute segment. He built it without slides, charts only, and a single narrative thread that he delivered from notes rather than reading. Before the meeting, in the corridor outside the boardroom, Renata fell into step beside him. She was in a dark suit, unhurried, the way she always was before rooms that other people found intimidating. "Nervous?" she asked. "No," he said. Then, "A little." "Why a little?" "Because the work matters and I want to represent it accurately." She considered this. "That's the right reason to be a little nervous," she said. "Not about the audience. About the work." He looked at her. "Is that how you think about it?" "It's how I learned to think about it. I used to be nervous about audiences." A pause. "Clara used to tell me that the way I talked in those rooms sounded like I was trying to convince them I belonged there." She was 9. The faintest thing in her voice. There and gone. 9-year-olds are occasionally devastating. "They are," he agreed. "She would have been." She stopped. Started again. "She would have made a good analyst." She asked the second and third question automatically. She never accepted the first answer. Callum thought of Petra. He thought of the sand dollar and the way she had said, "You can keep noticing that." "It doesn't go away," he said. Not a question, not advice. Just a statement, offered as one person offers another person a fact that has been expensive to learn. "No," Renata said. "It doesn't." She looked ahead at the boardroom door. "But it changes. The shape of it." They stood there for a moment in the corridor, 2 people in good suits, carrying between them the particular weight of having built their lives around the edges of absences, which is different from carrying loss and different from being defined by it. It is the thing that comes after both of those, the long ordinary business of becoming someone who continues. The boardroom door opened. A board member, silver-haired and courteous, looked out and saw them. "Ready?" Renata said. "Yes," Callum said. They walked in. The presentation went well. One board member challenged a finding in the acquisition analysis. Not the substance, but the confidence interval. Callum had anticipated it, had built his argument to carry it. He addressed it directly, offered the second-order data that narrowed the interval, acknowledged the limits of the remaining uncertainty without defending them. The board member nodded slowly. After the meeting, Gregor clapped Callum on the shoulder in the hallway and said something about paradigm shifts again. Yolanda from HR said the board had been impressed. A vice president from the San Francisco office, in town for the quarter, shook his hand and said the unit was doing work he hadn't seen at Arrowwood before. Renata said nothing, which had become, he understood, its own kind of thing. She moved through the post-meeting conversation with her usual economy, and when the group dispersed she caught his eye across the room. Just that, just a look, and he understood that it had meant what he'd hoped it meant. He left at 3:45 to pick up Petra. She was waiting outside the school, book under her arm, in the persimmon coat that she wore now as much on dry days as wet ones. She looked up when she saw him and walked over with the unhurried stride of a person who has been waiting and is accustomed to it and does not feel the need to rush now that the waiting is over. "How was it?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Really good, actually." "What did you notice?" He thought about the boardroom, about Renata in the corridor and what she'd said about Clara, about the shape of things, about the sand dollar and the coast and the waves that had been coming in a long time and planned to continue. "I noticed," he said, "that the things that cost the most tend to also be the things that make you better at your job." Petra walked beside him. The street was bright with the particular low gold of a late autumn afternoon, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been considered before it was placed. "That sounds like something from a book," she said. "Maybe. Was it a good day?" "Yes," he said. "It was a very good day." She slipped her hand into his, not a childish gesture, not a needy one, just the simple, matter-of-fact claim of a person who has decided that the company of this particular other person is where she wants to be right now. They walked the 6 blocks home through the amber afternoon, past the cathedral and the coffee shop and the corner where the yellow maple had dropped all its leaves overnight, leaving a clean ring on the pavement that looked, Petra had told him once, like the tree had been standing in a spotlight. The sand dollar was on her windowsill. The solar system, repaired and rehung after the science fair, turned slowly in a draft above her desk. Dinner would be rice and black beans and eggs, because it was a Wednesday. He had noticed, at the start of this year, that his life was a series of ordinary things arranged with more care than most people would recognize as care. He noticed it again now. He thought, not for the first time, that this was the whole secret. Not the methodology documents, not the dissent rights written into charters, not the boardroom presentation or the correct confidence interval or any of the things that had moved his career from one room to a higher one. Those were real, and he was proud of them in the quiet way he was proud of things. But the secret, the thing underneath all of it, the thing that made him capable of walking into difficult rooms and asking the second and third question and anticipating the objection before it became a weapon, was simpler and older and had nothing to do with competence. It was that every morning he made breakfast for a small person who trusted him completely, and every evening they told each other one thing, and the practice of noticing, really noticing slowly with your whole attention, had made him better at everything else. He did not think this was unique to him. He thought most people who were genuinely good at their work had some version of this. Some daily practice that had nothing to do with work at all, that was in fact the whole foundation of it. He just happened to know what his was. Petra appeared in the kitchen doorway in her socks, the sand dollar in her hand. "Can we put it on the table for dinner?" "Sure." She set it in the middle of the table, in the space between the salt and the bowl of fruit, like a small centerpiece. She stood back and looked at it. "It's good there," she said. "It is," he agreed. He turned back to the stove. The oil was heating. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog was barking at something it would never catch. The kitchen smelled of warmth and oregano and the faint, good smell of a house that had been lived in consistently and with attention. Petra sat down at the table. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. I think this is one of those days that will seem far away later and we'll wish we could come back to it." He looked at her, this 9-year-old person, this inheritor of her mother's eyes and her own entirely original mind. "Then let's stay in it for now," he said. She picked up her fork. "Deal," she said, and the evening settled around them, unhurried and whole,